You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Welcome back. Now, all show we've been telling you about partisan fights over the Safety Act, but there were a couple instances of bipartisanship during this veto session. Now, during the pandemic, the state drained its unemployment trust fund, and it even went $4 billion in debt. Last spring, the state contributed $2.7 billion to help alleviate that debt for business owners and the unemployed. But it was up to those two groups to make up the rest of the difference. And it would have meant higher taxes for businesses and lower benefits for the unemployed in the state. But now, Governor Pritzker announced that the state will be covering the rest of that debt, saving business owners a ton of money in the process. Joining us now is AFL-CIO Treasurer Pat Devaney. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Cole.
I want to start here. Back in the spring, we heard that labor and businesses groups were not going to be able to make an agreement when it came to paying back this fund. You were going to reassume the negotiations in the fall. All of a sudden, you find out the state has a giant surplus of $3.69 billion of estimated excess revenue. And a couple weeks later, we have a deal to pay back all of this money. How did this all evolve? Was this really just over the past few weeks that this deal, was reached?
Yeah, we've been in really intense negotiations over the last 9 months. You're right, we failed to reach an agreement in the spring. And when we came back and started negotiations again this fall, we did learn that there was excess revenue available to help us pay back the federal borrowing that had to take place to be able to provide benefits during this unprecedented pandemic. We initially owed $4.5 billion. The state came up with $2.7 billion in ARPA funds in the spring. The trust, because of historically low levels of unemployment currently, was able to pay back an additional $450 million. And now in this agreed bill, the state is going to pay back the remaining just under $1.4 billion to the federal government.
So, I'm sorry, I got the number wrong there. It was just $1.4 billion that the state is chipping in here. But this is all rooted with the unemployment trust fund and the amount of money that the state had to borrow during the pandemic and to pay out all of the unemployment benefits that came out of that. If this deal didn't happen, we would have seen higher rates for businesses and lower benefit costs. Is that true? Was that the ultimatum, basically?
It's absolutely true. Effective January 1st, 2023, coming up here in just about a month, benefits would have been lowered for unemployed workers who rely on that money to be able to get by when they're temporarily unemployed, and taxes would have gone up for employers even greater than they would have otherwise. The other thing that would have happened is businesses over the course of the repayment, because there's already a structure, an existing statute to pay back federal borrowing, and that's through increased state taxes and loss of federal tax credits for employers, they would have had to pay almost $1 billion more in employer taxes over the course of the repayment period compared to what is going to take place now that we have this agreed bill in place.
And that was the whole, really avoiding that interest and avoiding how that fund grows. That's the difference here, because the money is still being paid back to the state. I think Governor Pritzker described it as an interest-free loan when he was talking about this. Some of that money is getting paid back.
Well, there's
correct?
Two components to it. There's the just under $1.4 billion repayment to the federal government, and then there's an additional $450 million loan they're going to put into the trust to jumpstart it, to create a better path to solvency down the road. Those are the two pieces that are really, there's an additional two pieces that have really been overlooked. We're also going to incrementally increase the taxable wage base. That's the amount that employers pay unemployment taxes on each employee. And we're also going to increase the funding target for the trust fund. It's been $1 billion for almost 2 decades, which a lot of things have happened in the economy. Wages have increased. We're going to increase that to $1.75 billion to make sure that the trust fund is better prepared for even like mild times of higher unemployment. We're going to create an additional solvency within the fund. So all in all, this is a great deal for workers. This is a great deal for business and employers, but it's also a great deal for taxpayers because, as you pointed out, the state is on the hook for the interest payments for that federal borrowing, which is going to be paid off to where the state's not going to have to pay that out of its general fund.
So businesses should still expect some some higher rates in that incremental increase you were talking about, but not nearly as high as they would have had without this state funding.
There's going to be some modest increases to employer taxes, but it pales in comparison to what they would have seen had we not been able to put this agreed bill deal in place, almost $1 billion in savings for employers.
This was a just really interesting negotiation throughout the past year, especially this is the third payment into the unemployment trust fund that the state is making. The first one was the big one that was it 2.4 billion?
2.7.
2.7 billion, I'm sorry, on the first payment, and then there was an additional payment made during the summer just to help ease that burden just a little bit more. But really, that's where we thought the state was going to stop with this, and the businesses and labor were having to come to that agreement in the middle. Tell me how this whole discussion evolved as the state found out they had more money, and as you're fighting for that initial payment from the state, and how much that was going to go into the trust fund just from that 2.7 billion.
Yeah, it was incredible, and really we were very fortunate that the General Assembly and Governor Pritzker has been able to manage the state finances for the last 4 years, and we've experienced higher than usual revenues to where we had excess revenue that could be part of the final mix in the agreed bill. That certainly made it a lot easier to get to the agreement, but you're right, $4.5 billion the state has paid back for unprecedented levels of unemployment due to the pandemic. That's never happened before, and it definitely was a huge benefit for employers that would have otherwise had to pay that through employer taxes.
When the state initially kicked in that 2.7, they said, this is what we're going to put, this is all we can put. We heard at the press conference earlier this week announcing this deal, Republicans were there. This is a bipartisan deal. They said this is a good idea, we support it. But they were also saying this is probably what we should have done from the beginning. Did you understand the state's position when they were not pitching in that over $4 billion, the full 4.5 from the get-go, and their decision to leave some of this, at least at first, to business and labor to figure out?
When we left in the spring, we thought the $2.7 billion out of the ARPA funds was going to be the last payment that the state was going to be able to make. When we learned over the summer, because of the state's economy doing well and creating jobs in Illinois, that the trust fund was accumulating funds at a much higher rate than usual, and they were able to pay an additional $450 million out of the trust, that was great news. And then when we heard 3 weeks ago, when the governor released the economic forecast for the next 5 years and reported in FY23 that ends June 30th of next year, that we had an excess of something like $1.7 billion due to the great job the administration has done with the budget and managing the state's finances, that made it possible for them to make an additional payment and avoid any employer taxation having to go towards the federal borrowing. You
mentioned the additional measures that are being taken to, have the solvency for the account, make it safer than it was, higher target fund and everything above that $1 billion mark. Obviously, the effects of the pandemic were catastrophic on the account, but how often is the unemployment trust fund currently, getting into trouble, or maybe getting drained a little bit more than it was expected?
That's a great question, Cole, because in the last 20 years, we've gone into the negative, gone into the red in the trust fund and had to execute federal borrowing on 3 different occasions. We did it in 2004, we did it after the Great Recession in 2008, and now definitely for the pandemic and an unprecedented levels of unemployment. But because we hadn't made changes to the system to keep up with the economy, to keep up with the growth in wages, the system was antiquated in its funding approach. So these 2 additional measures, raising the taxable wage base and increasing the funding target by a significant amount, is going to not only provide a safety net and make sure that we're putting away money during good times, so it's there when higher unemployment strikes in the future.
And that's something that business was on board with as well in these negotiations, or was that something that took some convincing?
I think when you talk to people in the business community, predictability and being able to plan for the future is something they very much desire. So creating a system that is healthier and is solvent in the future is better for them, because then they're not hit with higher taxes when they don't plan on experiencing higher levels of unemployment.
All right, Pat Devaney with the AFL-CIO, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Cole, I appreciate it.
We'll be right back.